Hi, it's Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made my miniature Townhall set that I'm going to use for my next stop motion animation to be released at the end of May 2022. I built every little thing by hand and from scratch. The most challenging part of this build was the staircase and the banister, and I'm going to show you step by step how I've done it. In case you're doing your own staircase and banister, I wish you good luck. It's not an easy one, but it's a beautiful structural piece within a set. So I hope you enjoy this video and that it can help for your own project. For this particular project, I've decided to reuse an old base from a previous miniature set. My platforms are always raised because it's for stop motion animation, so I need to make sure I can access underneath for the screws of my little puppets. This time the plywood was 18mm thick and I've added some studs. Then I place the plywood and screw it in place. The fact that it's screw instead of nail means I can remove them, so every wall are removable and completely modular. You notice the back wall is much taller because my initial thought was I need the back wall to be 2-story high and the side wall don't necessarily need to be 2-story because they would not be seen on screen. But I changed that later on, as you will see. Then I start to build up my mock-up with cardboard. Try to define how many steps, in which direction, the width, the depth, which components, and I think working with cardboard is just such a cheap and quick way to get the proportion, to understand how the volume is going to work within the space. And I've placed a piece of cardboard for what is supposed to be the second floor. At that point I can get a sense of how everything is going to work, and I felt more confident moving forward. Then I spent lots of time drawing it and get into much more detail. What exactly going to be the dimension, the depth, the width, the proportion of just about every single component. And I've done a few different tests to see how everything is going to work together. So it needs to make visual sense on paper first before I start building it. So I made a drawing for every single wall as well as the floor plan. And I thought it was useful to use some marker pen just to work on contrast. It doesn't need to be the final color. As you can see, my markers were dying halfway through. But just to give a sense of the color palette and how contrasting colors are going to guide your eyes, especially through such a structure element as a staircase. An important sketch was also the floor plan, which highlighted the proportion of the second floor. I made a sketch for the front of the building, the exterior, and the interior of that same wall. Then I can remove my cardboard pieces, my little furniture, and start to work on the actual set. I marked up on the wall where the floor level is and start cutting some doors out. I've used my main sketch and placed some tracing paper over it, tape it in place, use a permanent marker to go over the line of the staircase and the main structure of it. I've cut this paper out and use it as a template to copy it 3 times on a piece of plywood and cut it out with the jigsaw. Now you can see my 3 layers. The front layer I removed the doors, but I didn't remove them on the internal layer. Also, if you have some leftover wood, that's perfect for this kind of project because you're not going to see it, so it doesn't matter if it's in different parts or it's got some old paint, that's fine. Then I've got some spacer with the leftover ply. Then I position them, line them up, and use a nail gun to hold them in place. Keep building it up, adding more layers. It doesn't need to be pretty, that doesn't matter, nobody gonna see it as long as it's lined up. That's what really matters. And I just kept building it up until I have my 3 layers. Then I went back to my sketch, this time to draw a template for the part of the staircase that stick out in front of it. Copy it 3 times on some ply. So I have my 3 parts done, and I've also cut some spacers. If you use a nail gun, be very careful when you work on such tiny pieces. And then I have my structure. I marked up a line where the central part should be and line it up with my new structure for the staircase in front. Make sure it's really lined up and nail it in place. Then I can reassemble all my pieces and place the structure of my staircase in the middle of it. Then for the upper part of the staircase, I made a little template on a graphic paper, copy it on a piece of basswood, I think it was 5mm thick, copy it 6 times, 3 for each side. Then cut some little spacer out of basswood as well and super glue in place. And this is what it looks like when it's glued together. Now I've placed it against the main staircase and realized, okay, I've got a part that touched, that's great. but there's not enough to hold it in place. So I decided to mark up with a pencil, then drill it with a drill bit that is the same size as some really thick wire. Then I was able to pass through, and so that gave me some strength to support the staircase that I place on top of it. I just shaped the wire, make sure they were at the right angle, they were the right fit against the basswood of my structure. Then I add some super glue on the basswood, add some more on the wire to make sure they will bond together, and then I was able to close the little box from underneath with another sheet of basswood. As you can see, the wire was going much further inside of it up to the piece of plywood, so that will help support it and help the load. So with this amount of wire, I can guarantee it was not going anywhere. Then I start to work on the second floor, making a template with a sheet of tracing paper on top of my drawing, cut it out and copy it in plywood. Then I position it, make sure it was a nice fit, and then I mark up the top line and underline and drill into it. But then I realized it would be really useful if the central point was actually a wooden dowel. So I've drilled a bit larger, the size of the wooden dowel, inserted into it, and done the same on both sides. That way I can anchor the plywood into the wall. That gives me time to reach my drill and get some screws on each side. So the screws are going to make it hold much better and tighter against the wall, but at least with the wooden dowel I've got an anchor point. And with the screws on each side, it wasn't going anywhere either. I like the fact that I can completely remove the staircase components so that I can start working on the doors on each side, placing a piece of plywood from underneath, super glue it in place. Then I can cover the edges on each side with some basswood and super glue and trim the top off with a Stanley knife. Then there was quite some gaps, so I used some wood filler to fill them up, let it dry and sand it down. Then I decided to tackle the tile floor. Usually I apply some EVA foam with some contact adhesive. This type of glue absolutely stinks, so I usually leave it outside, and I forgot about it until that morning when it was 3 degrees outside and I thought about using it, and by then it was a big mass. So it was really difficult to apply. It was a massive chewing gum and I struggled with it because it was creating lumps. So I tried my best to apply my sheets of 5mm EVA foam. I didn't have a full-size sheet to cover the whole space, so I've just make my best with what I had. I had all the lumps showing up, so I was a bit disappointed, but by then I learned my lesson. From now on I will leave the contact adhesive to get at room temperature before using it. Then I cut the edges, leave it outside because that stuff stinks, and then I went back to my staircase. I start to work on the stringer that goes on each side of the staircase. Made a little template once again with some graphic paper, copy it onto a piece of basswood, cut it out with my little Japanese saw, and I like to use a nail file to smooth the edges. Then I place my whole staircase structure back in position, and I start to decide that the bottom steps will be wider. I think it gives a much nicer effect visually. So I trace them up with some permanent marker on the foam and cut some blocks of basswood to match those volumes. I super glue those basswood blocks to each other and to the main staircase structure. Then I start to super glue the stringer on each side and tackle the staircase itself. I start with the riser because that's the first thing you're gonna see. I've put the riser up to the bottom layer, but I was just not too happy with how it turned out, even if I sand it down. So I place a sheet of baking paper underneath to avoid making a mess, press some wood filler onto it, let it dry and sand it down. Then I kept working on it, adding the steps one by one, taking my time. Especially for the step that sticks out, they need to be cut so that could be a nice fit. In particular the bottom step, that's an important one, so I took my time with it. And then I just kept going the same way with the rest of the staircase, adding the riser, adding the stringer to cover the riser's bits, and then the steps above it. I took the whole piece out, which was easier for me to work on the paneling. First I cut all my little pieces in different sheets and thicknesses of basswood, make a dry fit first, and then super glue each component together. I continue the paneling throughout on the other walls. I think it's always useful to mark it up with a pencil first so you know exactly what goes where. For the skirting detail, something very easy to do is to take a piece of basswood, maybe 3mm thick, round up the top of it, and then you take a sculpting tool or even a screwdriver, that will do, and you mark up some line. And because basswood is so soft that just pressing into it, the mark will stay there. And my advice is to go deeper than what you think, because otherwise the paint is going to fill it up in no time. Then I start to line up the EVA foam where the staircase were ending, all around it. Then I start my measurement, realizing I haven't lined up my staircase perfectly, so everything is off, and I had to cheat a little bit. I wanted to have those diamond inserts, and to create those into the foam, I realized I need to find a new way of doing it. So I found this little bit of brass that was the perfect size in my workshop, and I thought that's going to be brilliant. So now the way I've done it is probably not how you should do it, but you know what? It works, and that's what mattered to me. So I just wrapped it up in a thick piece of cloth and used a bit of duct tape for good measure. Then I put some gloves on and heat it with a heat gun until the metal was hot, and then I can press it onto the EVA foam. It's not enough to have the metal pressing, it needs to be hot so that the foam can melt and the shape will stay. Once again, it's probably not how you're supposed to do it, but it works. Then I use the wood burning tool and connect my line, still using some gloves, and ideally you're doing outside with a mask. So I was happy with the overall shape, but because there was quite some lump underneath the EVA foam, I wasn't happy with that part. So I thought I'm gonna pretend like it was meant to be there and add more texture. I use my loyal Liquidex. It's a brilliant texture medium, but it stinks and it takes a few days to dry, so that's worth taking into consideration. I'm applying with a palette knife throughout, remove what got into the grooves, then sprayed with water, and then use a sponge soaked in water to apply the texture throughout. Then I had to remove what got back into the grooves, and that took lots of time. Once it was all done, I let it dry for a few days. Now while that was drying, I'm going to talk about the little piece on the side of the staircase. I made it out of Super Sculpting. I took a leftover piece of foam board and glued the first layer of Super Sculpting to it and started to slowly shape it with my sculpting tools and create a nice curl. I need to do it for the right and the left side, and I make sure that I sculpt them next to each other so I know they're going to be the right size and they match. I've also built up some corbel. For that, I've used some basswood that I super glued to another leftover piece of foam board, stick another piece vertically, add a little triangle, and then cover the whole thing with some polymer clay and start sculpting it and get into much more details. I've done a medium corbel and a big one. It took some time to create those little details, and I think one tool that was really useful for it is one that I discovered not long ago. It's a clay gun that I bought into a hobby craft store. So this will extrude the clay in lots of different shapes, which is brilliant. I've enjoyed working with it, but something I need to point out is you need proper strength because of the density of the clay to be able to pass it through those tiny holes. But that gives you some really nice regular shape to work with. And that was something very useful for the next ceiling rows, for example. As you can see, you need to have consistency in the depth of the little clay parts that you use to compose an element like this. So once I was happy with all my architectural trims, I decided to make some molds, and for that I used some cardboard and the hot glue gun, make absolutely sure there is no gap. And then I mix up some silicone. This is the one I use all the time. It's not too expensive and it's set very, very quickly. So I've used some clear yogurt pot to make sure I have the same proportion of part A, part B. Then mix them up together in a container. This container should have been a bigger one. And once it was properly mixed up, then I pour it into yet another container to make sure absolutely everything was properly mixed up. And then I pour it into the mold. And less than an hour later, I can take the walls out, take the mold, remove the clay, and trim the edges of my silicone molds. Then I use some fast cast resin. FC 120 is the one I use all the time. It's brilliant. Mix the same quantity of part A, part B. Then mix it up in one container properly, and then pour it into the mold and try to not make as much of a mess as I've just made here. And make sure you have some cardboard underneath because it's going to get everywhere and it's going to get very messy otherwise. After 20 or 30 minutes, you can take them out and they look really cute. Then they need a good trim, so I've used some sanding paper to trim the base, an X-Acto blade to go into every little details of it. Now to super glue such tiny little pieces, I came up with the solution of using an old sculpting tools, add a bit of white tack to it so I can gently press into my resin part, dip it into the super glue, and then I can press it in position without having to use my hands directly, so I don't have my fingers completely stuck to it. That really helps. Then I can see I needed to add a bit of wood filler, sand it down, just to get some nice edges. Now I'm going to talk about the front of the building. So I've got a piece of plywood to the right size following my drawing, cut a little arch to go inside of the building and a wider arch to go outside of it. Then I super glue those parts to the main board for the inside and the outside. Then I sand it down, add a bit of wood filler, let it dry, and then sand it down with a little Dremel. Then I've positioned some studs outside of it, place a bit of plywood on top of it, and another piece of plywood to create the first step towards the door. Then I use a nail gun to hold them in place and a little bit of super glue. Now I thought, considering I've got a big arch, it would be really cool to have some steam wood to follow this curve. So now I decided to do some experiment and steam bend some woods. It's probably not the right way of doing it, as I figure out. I'm just going to show you how I've tested things out. I've placed my balsa wood into a heatproof container and used some boiling water and let it soak for at least an hour. Then I still had the offcuts of the door, so once the wood was absolutely soaked, I press it and shape it around my arch and then put back my offcut inside of it to force it into position. Once again, it's probably not the proper way of doing it, but I wanted to experiment with this one. So while that was taking shape, I decided to focus on the windows. I've started with the window sills, cutting some piece of balsa wood, one that I can insert from outside and another one that's going to match for the inside. I've sand them down, super glue in position, the outside first and then the inside. And once it was all glue, I can sand it down to make sure they match. Then I start to use my favorite materials, Worbla. It's a fantastic thermoplastic. I hit it with a heat gun and start doing all the windows around with it. Gently pressing it into position. Make sure I keep it warm. If it starts to cool down, you can just bring the heat gun back and keep shaping it and curving it. I find it really useful to have the metal ruler as well to help create some clean straight lines. And just keep working at it until you have a nice shape that you're happy with. I went with another wider part of Worbla to cover the bigger arch. Once it's cooled down, the Worbla has a nice shape, but it's not attached to the plywood, so I still need to use some super glue to make sure it's bonded on the plywood. Then I start to work on the outside of the building, this time with a much wider part of Worbla, same as before, covering the whole thing. Then I went back to my experimental steam bend wood. Well, technically there's a curve, so I've achieved something, but obviously it broke because I didn't do it properly. But I thought, you know what, I have two broken parts, but if I cut them, I can make a whole one. So as it was some component that will be underneath other layers and it's not going to be seen anywhere, I thought, you know what, might as well just go with it. So I just cut some bits off, make sure I can go all around it, and then I super glue them in position. And I cover it with Worbla. So you won't see it, it doesn't matter as much, but it was just good to experiment and try new techniques out. With Worbla you can do so much things. You can actually roll it up, make sure it's always hot, so keep going back and forth with the heat gun and just roll it and basically use it almost like a clay. You can do anything you want with it. That's brilliant. I like to use the metal ruler to compress it, shape it as well. And then I just trim the edges and start to use it for the inside of my art to create even further depth. I just make sure both sides were heated so that they can bond nicely together. Then to create the stones effect on the front of the building, I went back to my drawing, cover it with some tracing paper, tip it into position and go over every line with the marker pen. Cut it out and use it as a template to mark all around my arches where the stone needs to be. Then I start to build up with some piece of balsa wood or Worbla to create some volume. Add one more piece of thin balsa wood at the front. sand it down to make sure I have some nice smooth edges, and then add another piece of Worbla. This one is a classic type of Worbla. It doesn't matter whatever you have, it will do the job. So I just keep it, hit it, shape it all together, and then I've added some texture. So for that it needs to be hot as usual, and then I use my sculpting tool, the one with the little balls at the end of it, and just hammer it until I had my stone texture, as you can see here. For the stone effect in front of the building, usually I glue some EVA foam and then I sculpt it with a wood burning tool, but this time I decided to take a shortcut and do it differently. So I just mark up my line with a permanent marker, also mark up the detail of the windows with the stone effects around it. I went back with my Worbla to create the window surround. Add a bit more Worbla on the outside and then another layer, and make sure it was bonded to the layer underneath to create the stones, and make sure it's still hot so I can hammer some texture into it. I've decided to add a piece of thick basswood at the base, supposed to be big blocks of stones, and then I've done my texture mix. So I mixed some sands, any type of sand will do. This is just basic builder sand, and I mixed some PVA. I happen to have some clear PVA, but any PVA will do. The advantage of clear PVA is that you can see through. So once I apply all my texture throughout, I can still see my lines with a permanent marker, and I can use a lollipop stick to just remove all the grains and the texture that got on top of those lines. And I kept adding more layers of this PVA and sand texture throughout and let it set overnight. Now I was happy with how it looks from the front of the building, but I still had more work to do inside. I had more work to do with the paneling on the back wall. For the windows around, I went back as before with the Worbla and took my time to shape it. Once the back wall was done, I started focusing on the second floor. Then I took the second floor part in plywood and drill for the lights to go through. Take it upside down. For the part that is above, I drew what's going to be the trenches so that my wire can go from one light to the next. And I took a little wood knife to cut the trenches out. I found it easier than to work with a Stanley knife. Then I made sure my trenches were deep enough to hold not just the wire but the little LEDs. I've also drilled into my ceiling rows and superglued them in position. I realized this part of the panel underneath will look better with a little wooden end bits. So I placed some basswood in position, realized I need to create a curve. For that, I've placed some tracing paper underneath, take a pencil and draw the curved shape that I needed, cut the paper out, copy it in wood, and then I can superglue it in position and sand it down. So I have a nice curve. Then I place my little corbel, take some measurement, make sure they have nice space in between, line it up with a pencil to make sure what goes where, and I've done the exact same thing with the front panel as well. I start to work on the coving. For that I have some triangle basswood that you can buy already made. Now I need to curve them up, so I've placed them into a mitre box that I've duct taped onto my table so that it stays in position, and use some sanding paper around a round dowel so that I can sand it down and create a little curve so it's not as straight as it was before. Then I divide this component into 2/3 and 1/3. So once you put all this together like a little sandwich, you can see the coving is coming together, and that's going to be a nice fit with my corbel. I superglue them together on a piece of baking paper. It's easier to do and it avoids having it sticking to the table. And this is what it looks like when it's superglue. You have a little bit of coving. Then I've cut my coving to size and then start to superglue it to the wall, and to the wall only. Put the ceiling in place so that I can make sure it was glued and try to avoid as much gap as possible with the ceiling. Now, if you only put superglue on the part that is touching the wall, that means you can still remove the top part, which is important to keep the modularity of the whole set. I've also added the bigger corbel on the back wall, and I make sure I line them up and they are square to the top of the ceiling. Now I'm going to talk about the windows. I've used some clear plastic. It looks opaque at the moment because it's got some protective layers on each side, and use a permanent marker to mark the right dimension. I decided to create 2 panels because I wanted to make my life more complicated, but I also wanted to create the effect of the sash windows where you have those 2 panels that slide. I cut them up with a scissor, make sure they fit with the drawing, and then I can remove the protective layer. Then I cut a thin slice of PLA, it's a white plastic. If you have other plastic that might work as well. Then I apply a thin line of super glue onto a piece of baking paper. That means I can dip the end of my plastic panel into it gently and then press it firmly onto my PLA line. And after a few seconds, in theory, it holds. Once I have my PLA white line underneath, I can start working on the grills. My favorite brand of 3D paint is Paper San Relief, and I let it dry for at least a few hours, ideally overnight. I've also cut a bigger piece of plastic for the central windows, for the back wall. Remove the protective layers and tape it into position against my drawing, and then went over every line very carefully and patiently. Once the 3D paint was dry, I can turn the windows around and create the other sides. I've done this for the windows that were in the front of the building because you can see them from either sides. Now for some reason I've decided to super glue it directly onto the board. I should have waited until the whole thing was painted instead of having to protect it later on, but I wanted this instant gratification of seeing them coming together, I guess. So I just add a little bit of super glue, place it, and once it was firmly attached, then I can go on the other side and add the last bits of the PVO San Relief to connect those pieces together. Now I'm going to talk about the little doors. I've added a piece of cardboard at the back of the opening for the doors and cut some basswood, thin one for the first layer and then thicker one, I think it was 3mm thick, for the second layers. Then I start to super glue them onto my piece of card, and then add the second layer. Use a nail file to make sure everything was smooth, especially the transitions. For the part that is above the door, let's call it a door header. I've used a thicker piece of basswood and just used the metal ruler to press lines into it. It's just such a soft wood that you will make some mark very easily into it. And then I took some other piece of basswood of different thicknesses, different width and different size, and I sandwiched them together to create this trim. And once you paint them and age them, you have a nice door surround. Now when it comes to the lighting, for all my sets I use those micro LEDs that you can find very easily on eBay and Amazon for super cheap. I think this one was probably 10 meters of micro LEDs that I've used for this one. I grouped them together, at least a dozen of them, twist the wire around and then gently press to pass them through the holes. Shape them from underneath to make sure they are at the same level. From above, I've used the glue gun and filled the trenches with glue so that I can have the wire and the extra LEDs sticking in them. And then I've added a bit of duct tape to make sure the LEDs will not shine through the floorboard that I was about to install. Then I've applied some PVA, mine is clear, but any type of PVA will do. And add thin strips of basswood on top of it to lay my flooring. Then I cover everything with some board and some heavy books and let it dry overnight. The next day I can trim the edges, sand it down, and I have a floor. I realize I need to add a nice trim on the curved edge of this flooring, so I've used some Worbla. This time I have some black and white Worbla. The color is completely irrelevant, use whatever you have, that will do the job. I've just warmed it up and then took my time to shape it so that it follows the line on each side and creates a nice detail. So now let's go back to the staircase. So I took my time to drill some holes in the middle of each step with a drill bit that is exactly the same size than the wooden stick I'm going to use next. Then I dip those wooden sticks into the super glue and take my time to make sure they are absolutely straight. Then I cut some pieces of PLA, I think probably 5 or 6 millimeter wide. I made a little sketch on graphic paper to measure up the exact distance between the baluster when they are at an angle. Once I have that measurement, I copy it onto my piece of PLA and then very carefully I drill into it with the same drill size than the baluster. And I had to cut much more than needed because I had quite a few breakage for this one. Then I've used those PLA plates to connect all the baluster that was straight and aligned, not the curved one, just the one that was straight up. Then add some super glue. ideally if you have one with a kicker, so you make sure that is set straight away and firmly. Then I use my Japanese saw to cut the excess off at the right angle and sand it down. So this is what I had so far. At least I had some strength holding some of the baluster in position. Then for the handrail, I started with the half dowel of EVA foam that I had left over from another project. I thought that's the perfect shape and it's bendable, so that's very good. I've cut it at a sharp angle, warm it up with a heat gun, and then start to curve it onto itself and hold it while it was cooling down. So now the change in temperature helps holding the shape a little bit, but not enough. It needed some super glue. So I went underneath and had a good layer of super glue with the activator to hold its shape. Then I very slowly and patiently start to line it up on top of the PLA and on top of the freestanding baluster, and it was very tricky, it was very fiddly to just try to have a line that works and that each baluster is still standing up straight and connected to it. Once that was finally done, I was happy with the top part, but you can still see the PLA plate underneath, which wasn't pretty, so I decided to use some Worbla on each side, which really helped. It looks better. So it looks good from the top, it now looks good from the side, but from underneath it was still a bit of a mess. So I've used some wood filler, which is what ended up working best, and I took quite some time to sand it down, add a bit more wood filler, sand it down again. Oh, that was a long part. So I decided to learn from it and do it better for the next part of the handrail that's going to come on the second floor. For that, I've done a template in paper first, marking up each of the baluster where they need to be. Then I copy this template onto a PLA. Any type of plastic will probably do. And so I can use this template to drill into it where the baluster needs to fit. And I went all around it. Then I dip the little wood stick into super glue, try to do my best to have them standing straight up. Then I've copied the paper template onto a piece of Worbla and I slide it into it. You're gonna see later why. Then I've used the PLA template, this time to slide on top of it. And like previously, I've added some super glue, used the activator, make sure it's firmly attached. Then cut the excess with the little saw and sand it down. Then I've applied my half dowel of EVA foam on top of this PLA plate, and then I turned the whole thing upside down, used some studs to make sure it was lifted from the table so I don't press and damage the handrail that I just positioned in. And then I can press downwards the Worbla part to put it against the handrail, and then I use the heat gun and gravity will do its work and the Worbla will naturally fold and wrap up the handrail. Now you're approaching with the heat gun next to a piece that has been super glued, so it might release some fume. Make sure that you have the window wide open. It's not ideal, but as you can see, I turn it upside down and it's done. I still need a bit of adjustment here and there. I keep warming it up and shaping it with a sculpting tool, but it's literally saved me hours of time and with a much cleaner look at the end of it. Then I position the ceiling back in position, and the problematic part is usually when two components fit each other. Because I want all my sets to stay modular, there's always one point where they connect to each other, which is a bit more complicated to do. And once I was happy with that, I just continue with the paneling throughout, all the detailing that's still needed, and here I have something that was kind of done. So once I was happy with it, I start to work on the priming. For that, I've used some white gesso throughout on every single wall and every surfaces. Same for the inside paneling. Then for the floor, I've added 2 coats of acrylic paint, then use a sponge to add more colors into it. For my little diamond insert, I've used a wooden bit that was exactly the right size and dip into paint so I can just apply the right amount of paint where I want. I've sealed it with a clear matte sealer. Then for the grout, I've applied some diluted grey with a contrasting color to what I've done before throughout. Remove the excess with a wet paper towel. And then to finish it, apply some clear matte varnish. I've also done washes throughout, so every single piece of paneling, of everything basically, I've done washes using usually some dark diluted acrylic paints, and I remove the excess with wet paper towel. Now for the doors, I've used some card as a base. I've superglued some tiny hinges on each side and mark where the paneling needs to be. Then I build it up with some basilwood at different thicknesses until I had both sides of the door done up. Then I can just prime and paint and age like everything else. Then I patiently trim the window part and try to superglue it in place. It's always tricky because you need to put as little superglue as possible. There's always a risk of the superglue whitening the glass, so it's a very tricky part to do, and I took my time for it. Same for the side windows, and once they were in place I can add the last bit of 3D paint, PBOs and relief to finish it off. For the door handle, I've used some flat wire. Then I use 2 pliers, jewelry pliers, and just bend it 90 degrees on one end. Then I can cut the excess to round it up and then use some metal files to round them up completely. So as you can see, you have a nice shape for the handles. Then I cut some rounded wire into little tubes, probably 4mm long. So I had my handles, I have my little tube, and the last bit is some very tiny eyelets. Then I can start superglue them to each other. First the tubes to the base eyelets, and then a little bit more superglue on top and the handles. And I think they look really cute. I've also used some flat wire to create the lampshade. This time it was white flat wire, and I wrapped it up around a bottle that was just the right shape, and then I very slowly open it up and use some super glue to hold the wires to each other. I mainly use the super glue from the inside to hold the structure. I've also created some wall lights with the same principle that I use for the ceiling lights. Then I needed extra component to hold these lights in place, so I use some Worbla, warm it up and wrapped it around some sculpting tools and let it cool down. I used some clear Worbla for the glass inside of the lights, cut some disc into it, warm it up and press it into the lampshade. Press it gently with some curved sculpting tools. I wanted to diffuse the lights a bit more instead of seeing the LED straight away, so I used some white paint, very experimental this one, but it works, and just press the paint on the glass panel. Then I still had a little gap in between the plastic and the flat wire, so I decided to cut some rounded wire and just add it to it. It added nice metal colors to it, and you just feel the gap. I've cut another piece of Worbla, this time cut a thicker hole in the middle of it, trim it out, and then I warm it up, bend the edges so that it matched the width inside of the lights, and once it was cold I can super glue it in place. So there you have a whole light done up. Then to install the light, first I position the little tube of Worbla to hide the wires, and then I gently press all my LEDs into the lampshade, and then use plenty of super glue to make sure everything was holding together. I've added the wall light from behind the back wall by drilling into it and pressing probably a dozen of LEDs into those holes, and from the other side I can just super glue the little wall lights into position. Then it's all about adding those little details that makes all the difference. You see the little switch, the little sockets. This is just a piece of white plastic that makes such an impact visually. Same for the fire extinguisher. I mean, a block of basilwood and you just print a fire extinguisher on top of it, job done. Same for the notice board. Then add some furniture. I've reused the one I've done for the office set, if you want to know how to make them from scratch as well. And just add a little props so that it brings the whole set together. And there you go, job done. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Next time I'm going to show you how I made a very dated and derelict abandoned flat from scratch and by hand. See you next time.